All right, we should start. Um, this presentation is about MySQL, Amazon RDS, and about security. So my name is Alex. I have been doing MySQL work, MySQL consulting work for a long time. I've been doing that for more than 15 years. I actually started at MySQL AB, the company behind MySQL. And I was doing consulting, architecture, and other stuff. And I joined Amazon Web Services, Amazon Relational Database Service, about 2 years ago. And I'm currently working on database security. I'm leading a database security team at RDS. So so Amazon RDS, for a quick introduction, you probably all know this. Amazon RDS allows a customer to start a database in the cloud. And I'm working on the MySQL part of that. I'm working on RDS, MySQL, MariaDB, and also Amazon Aurora. So let me jump right into MySQL security. The typical MySQL security problems, and again, I'm only talking about MySQL. Right, typical MySQL security problem is Sql injection, privilege escalation. Let me show you one thing. This is bad code. And this guy is me. I was like looking at this code. And this guy is probably surprised. I'm not surprised. I'm looking at this code and I see bad things. Right? This is an Sql injection right here. To tell you the truth, this is not a real code. I created this code. I adapted this code to look at bad. So don't try it at home. This is a bad thing. So what's the problem with it? The problem here is that you can inject an SQL on top of the normal SQL. So the green one here is the original query that is generated by the code. And then the red one is someone bad, a bad actor, is trying to append this code to the original code. So, and actually in this example, it's so bad that anyone can do it in the browser, right? In the browser, you can just generate this query and it will work. You don't even need to escape the spaces here. It will just work. So, and this is a Sql injection. This is bad. But on top of everything, on top of just a simple Sql injection, why the application have an access to mysql.user database? Right? Because what happens here is that our bad actor can select from the mysql.user table and can retrieve the password. And then this is a hash of the password, and then you can run some tool to crack that password. So why does the application have an access to mysql.user table? And to answer this question, let's look at the history. So here is the typical MySQL. This is a typical web application based on MySQL database. And in this application, we have two databases. The first database is our web application, a front-end database. And the second database is some sort of back-end database, some processing, background processing, and stuff like that. And then we have a MySQL system database here. And MySQL system database stores the users and privileges. And what we did when we configure our application to work with database, MySQL database here, again, this is all historical stuff, right? Typically we have 3 users. The first user is our root user, the root user that has been created when you install MySQL. And it has all and every privilege on the database. And then we have 2 other users. The first user is for front-end database. The second user is for, let's say, cron processing, like background user. MySQL database is isolated here because our 2 users don't have an access to that. But then what happened is that the more complex architectures emerged. And I have been seeing lots of a new approach, a multi-tenant approach. Again, this is all historical stuff from 2010 maybe, where the database is, so basically the application will need to have a multi-tenant databases on a single MySQL server. So the typical approach is that we create a database per customer. And the application will create the database. So when a new customer will come in and sign up, we simply create a new database for that particular customer. We provision all schemas there, and then this customer will start using it. So this is supposed to be good, and that will provide an additional level of isolation. But what happened in reality, it was the opposite. Because when you create a schema per specific customer here, you should create a user which is only having access to this customer. Then you create another database and you create another user which will only have the access to that specific database. But what happened was the opposite. Actually, the application developers or application, designers started to create a single user which will have access to everything. And this is a really bad situation because in this particular design, you may have a privilege escalation. So what is the risk? If you have everything on MySQL, then you can actually have an access to mysql.user system table where username and passwords are stored. So you can get here, you can get the hash of password. And if the passwords are bad and easy, then you can, bad actor can crack that password. But even worse than that, if you look here, you can see insert, update, delete on everything. And what that means is that you can update mysql.user table and change the password for the admin user. So basically, you're giving an access for the application user. And the application user can change the password for the system user and can potentially reconnect. But so boom, we change the password here, right? But even worse than that, if you have an access to MySQL system database, you can do whatever. You can get yourself any missing privileges. Here, I am just doing a simple update. I am here granting myself a super privilege on everything. So this is really bad, and this is exactly what we have been seeing in the previous slides, where what happened is that an application had a security problem. An application had a Sql injection. And second, the privileges for the application user were too broad to include the MySQL system database access. And that allowed the bad actor to do pretty much everything on the database. So this is exactly what happened here, right? So controlling MySQL user table means that you can get meant that you can get any additional privilege. So this is, again, this is the historical stuff. This is what MySQL had and still have in the older versions. So what is the right thing to do in this architecture? Well, the right thing to do is at least do some isolation. So we have this pattern in creating the databases, where all the databases starts with Sql here, right? So the obvious way is to use the, in the creating of a user and granting the privilege, to use the same pattern here, right? So we can do Sql %, meaning that we only allow database access to the Sql databases and don't allow an access to the MySQL system database. But this is good. It's not good enough, but it's good. But what if we don't have a specific pattern? Let's say someone has designed this to be just hash of something. So we have a completely random database names. And in this particular case, it's very easy to make this mistake. It's very easy to just create a user and grant all the privileges. But that will introduce the privilege escalation path. So again, the user with a global read-write access to the MySQL database also have an ability to update MySQL user table in just MySQL and get the new privilege. So what I would like to have is somehow grant everything except. So I want to restrict my application user from updating the user table to get the additional privilege. So let's take a look at what changes has been made in MySQL 8.0, MySQL Community Edition. There are 3 new options that I'm really interested in: partial revokes, roles, and dynamic privileges. So partial revokes is exactly what we need. So partial revoke is, starting in 8.0.16, we have a possibility to grant everything except. And then except will be MySQL system database, because we don't want our users to mess up with the MySQL system databases and do bad stuff. Now, actually, MySQL 8 have changed a lot in how the MySQL system databases are organized. And originally, a long time ago, it was common to just change the privileges grant. Instead of doing grant command, just do update to add an additional privilege. Think about, anyone was doing that in Linux by changing etc password? Have anyone done that with changing etc password or etc shadow on Linux? No, this is the equivalent of that. So we don't really want that. So, and we want to restrict an access to the MySQL system database, right? So this is how it worked before. Let's say I want to restrict it. And I cannot. In MySQL 5.7, I cannot do this. If I try to do revoke all on MySQL after granting everything, it will complain and say there is no such grant. So in this case, MySQL system database is wide open. But now I can use this feature. I can enable this feature in MySQL 8 Community Edition. I can enable this feature and set partial revokes on. After I set this feature partial revokes on, I can grant everything on my application user. And then on top of that, I can revoke all on my SQL system database. So then my SQL will be protected. And let's try this escalation bad stuff. Let's try this bad stuff now. And then I have all the features that I need to get. Right? I can create table in a random database. Remember this crazy database names here. I can create table. I can create a new database like this. I can do everything except accessing my SQL system database. When I try to do update, I will get access denied. It's exactly what we want. Another feature that will be really helpful in MySQL is roles. Roles has been missing in MySQL for a long, long time. What is role? Role is just a named collection of privileges. It may not be a big deal, and historically we have been managing users without roles for a long time, but it's very convenient now to use roles. And it is similar to what other databases are allowing you to do. So what I can do now is I can convert my application user to a role in MySQL 8 Community Edition. So I can create a role. I can grant all privileges to that role. And then again, I will revoke all and every privilege on MySQL system database. So the MySQL system database will be protected. So it's a similar approach. It's the same thing from the security perspective, but it is much easier to manage that. So another thing that I need to do is I need to apply that role. And to apply that role, I do grant that role to my application user. And I'll also make it default. Make it default is super important because otherwise it will not apply when the user connects. So you set it at default, and then all the privileges that are granted or revoked to and from that role will be applied to that user. So it is just a convenience. It's easier to manage your privileges with roles. So this is what has been added to MySQL 8.0. So this is just to demonstrate how the grant will look like now. Right? If you do show grants for the application user, you will see that the app role has been applied to the app user. And then you may see the grant user here, usage here. It's a MySQL specifics. So usage stands for no privilege. It's just to show that this user exists, nothing more than that.
Login privilege, but not.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. That's a login privilege. Right. All right. So now, when we migrated our application user to roles, let's repeat what we tried to do. And we can see that, again, that works. The protection works. MySQL system database is protected. We can do all things that we need to do. And when we try to do update, it will deny our update. So our bad actor will not be able to change the password, even if someone will be able to get a Sql injection on the application. All right. Another very interesting feature, another thing that I have been always looking for those years, is split of the super privilege. Basically, historically, in MySQL, if you had a super privilege, you control everything. And this is not very good from the security point of view, where you want to split your privileges and use least privilege approach. So in MySQL 8, the super privilege has been split. The super privilege still exists, but there are a collection of what is called dynamic privileges that is much more granular. And those privileges will, and I will show you in a second how and what we did with Amazon RDS and Amazon Aurora. So again, we will be talking about Amazon Aurora, which is MySQL compatible edition, and we'll be talking about Amazon Relational Database as a Service, Amazon RDS for MySQL. So what's the problem? One of the problems inconvenient in any cloud database as a service was the absence of super privilege on MySQL. And again, super privilege is very broad, and Amazon RDS is a managed service, so it doesn't provide the super privilege. But because originally in MySQL, so every privileges was so tightly coupled with a super or no super, we have that specific problem. So I will show you examples based on Aurora MySQL, but same applies here for this particular thing. Still, same applies for MySQL RDS for MySQL.
Same applies for Google Cloud SQL as well.
Probably.
Yeah,
Probably. Yeah.
I know, yeah, they do.
OK. So that's a common problem, and the problem comes from MySQL, right? So this is a common problem. The problem is that if you don't have super privilege, if you didn't have super privilege before MySQL 8, you were not able to create your objects. And by objects, I mean triggers, procedures, functions, specifying a different definer. So when you create a new object, a procedure, function, trigger, and you don't specify the definer, the current user will be used as a definer. And that is fine, that is allowed. But when you try to create a new object and specify a different definer, without super privilege, you will not be able to do that. Again, that applies to MySQL before 8.0. And that was very inconvenient in one particular case, restoring MySQL backups. So basically, think about this. Think about this scenario. You're migrating to the cloud. You need to copy your data from your on-prem database to the relational database as a service or any database as a service offering. And what you do is you do MySQL dump. And you restore MySQL dump to your cloud database. And you get this. In many cases, people have been creating objects with a root as a definer, because basically it's the most convenient. It's not, again, it's not good for security, but it's the most convenient way. You connect to MySQL using your root user, and you create your triggers, you create your functions, you create your stored procedures. And when MySQL dump will produce the dump file, it will do this, create, define, or whatever, trigger. And when you try to restore it into the cloud database, you will get this. So there was an old blog post at Percona where there was a recommendation on this, doing this Perl regular expression, really old school. There are other options, but this is so inconvenient. And if you Google this error, you will find a number of Stack Overflow articles, questions, and stuff like that, all recommending you do this. Now imagine you get a dump, 200 gigabytes, 1 terabyte dump file. And what, you're doing regular expressions in Perl on this file? That's crazy. So there are, of course, other options to do that, better options, but this is basically the problem before 8.0. So in MySQL, Aurora, Aurora version 3, compatible with MySQL 8.0, introduces MySQL 8.0 community features. And one of the features that I was working on is support for the role-based authentication, right? So there are other features available in MySQL 8 that exist in Aurora version 3, but this is our focus. So role-based authentication and dynamic privileges. And dynamic privileges including set user ID to fix this exact issue that we have had for a long time. So let's take a look at that. So if you start Aurora version 3, Aurora MySQL version 3, and you do show grants, and the admin is the user that you specify when you create the database, right? And you do show grants for user admin, you will see this. So that means that you have roles. And we actually create by default, we create a RDS super user role and assign that role to the admin user. Admin user is the user that, again, you specify when you start, when you create an instance. And then you may want to try this. You can do update. You can try to do insert. This will not be allowed. So we have implemented a similar approach. And in Aurora MySQL 3, you don't have any access to the MySQL system database. Now, the common question that customers are asking sometimes is, how do we provision the privileges? Before that, you were allowed to do insert into MySQL user table and provision your privileges. But this is not the right way. And MySQL Community Edition from version 8.0 actively discourage you from changing the MySQL system database and dealing with MySQL.users manually. So again, my example originally was that, do you change etc password manually? You don't. Do you change etc shadow on Linux manually? You don't. So this is a similar thing. So what we did in Aurora, again, is we restrict the access, the write access to the MySQL system database. Now roles. One of the common asks by the customer is, can we use roles? So now you can. You can create your role. Like this is example is from the MySQL Community Edition help page, right? So now in Aurora version 3, you can create your own role. You can assign privileges to the role, and you can assign your roles to the users. So it's another convenient thing so that you can manage your users with roles in Aurora version 3. And finally, we have been able now to provide the set user ID dynamic privilege. With a set user ID, you can create an object and specify the definer. So that problems go away. You can create your trigger and specify different definer. That user should exist, but you can do that. So you don't have to use this crazy approach doing regular expressions on a terabyte file or whatever. So if you want to see it yourself, you can start Aurora MySQL version 3. Make sure that versions match. And then when you do show grants for your user, you should see set user ID. Because you can see set user ID, that means that you will be able to create your objects like this. So that will apply to restoring the MySQL dump files, and you don't have to mess with regular expressions again. All right, so conclusions. Original problem was that if you control your MySQL system database, you control the whole database. You can update your MySQL.user table, you can do other stuff, and you can get any privilege. Now with the implementation, with the introduction of partial revokes in community MySQL 8.0 and a similar thing in Aurora version 3, MySQL compatible with 8.0, this is pretty much, there is a path to fix this. So it doesn't, so basically you will be able to create a specific privilege which will allow access to everything except MySQL system database. With the MySQL system database protected, we don't have that issue anymore. And even if the application will have some security issues like Sql injections, the bad actor will not be able to do that damage to the database. All right, I think that's all that I wanted to talk about today. One thing I want to say is we are hiring. If you want to work on RDS, we have opening for database engineering. I have some papers here. I'm building a team of database security engineers. So if you're interested in that, or if you know someone, please contact me. I have my LinkedIn here. And I'm open to questions. All right, I guess it was very clear. Everything was really clear in this presentation. All right, thank you very much, guys.